Okay, welcome everyone to the second webinar on the domain information security governance and risk management. We had covered 28 slides in the last webinar series, and today we will try to see how many slides we can cover. The objective is to have good understanding of all the topics and complete as much as possible. So let's start with the new topic, which is all about roles and responsibilities. Senior management, we all understand, that's a very generic term. Let's understand more on what are the roles and responsibilities of a chief infosec officer are. So as the name suggests, a chief information security officer, right? He is the main person who this is a senior position. This is not something a junior position, as the name suggests, chief, right? So he is amongst the CXOs, the chief, equivalent to chief information officer. He takes the responsibility for the whole information security. So if you see here on the slide, we have written that responsible for understanding the business objectives of the organization. This is a very generic statement, not only chief information security officer. In fact, the other stakeholders in the company, all managers should understand the business objectives. Yeah, one of the important parameters which chief information security officer would be responsible for is he ensures that a risk assessment is performed. As it's an infosec role, risk assessment is the key requirement. And then communicating the risks to executive management. One important point which is not there on the slide is all about he is also responsible for ensuring that policies are set up. When I say policies, and it's an infosec position, so this is information security policy is drafted, and the policy awareness levels are up to the mark within the organization, and the policy's requirements are complied to. This is one of the points which is right now not there on the slide, but I can ensure that this is part of the chief infosec officer responsibilities. If you have any questions, please feel free to post on the chat window. Let's move on to the next concept. So here we have some more set of roles. We all know data owner. Owner is the person who will decide whether, so let's say if somebody has bought the car, who has paid for the car, so he is the owner of the car. He will decide who will drive the car. With it, is it Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C? Similarly, the data owner, he will decide as who will have access to that data. So let's say you have financial data, you should have an owner assigned to it. You have HR data, and owner should be assigned to it. Coming to data custodian, custodian is a word which is mainly used for IT. So let's say the owner decides, grant Mr. X access to my data. Now this is the responsibility of custodian to provide this access on an IT angle. So custodian will ensure that Mr. X role is defined with that role which has financial authorizations. So data owner, data custodian, these are simple terms. Please do not get confused in them. Then you have system owner. This is more from the person who is owner of the servers, firewalls, network switches, and all that. Then you have two very important terms which are majorly confused by CISSP aspirants. One of them is the system administrator, and the other is security administrator. I'll give you a thumb rule here. A thumb rule is a system administrator is responsible for creating a username within the system or within the application, and the security administrator is responsible for assigning various roles which are approved by the data owner to that username. So we are bringing segregation of duties here, right? So it should not happen that the system administrator is able to create a user and then he is able to assign, let's say, fixed assets administrator, and he is able to depreciate the company's assets. No. So that's where the role is segregated. One is creating the username and the other is assigning authorizations or privileges. So who is creating the username? System administrator. Who is assigning the authorizations and privileges? Security administrator. So similarly, the difference also comes, let's say you have to install a patch. So system administrator will install a patch, but which is the right patch which has to be installed? That will be decided by the security administrator. So again, we are trying to bring segregation of duties here. So all security perspectives are taken care by the security administrator, and the actual deployments or configurations or removal implementation is done by the system administrator. So this is where you must always understand what are the key differences. Majorly from experience in global conglomerates, both these positions are not uniquely maintained. It is the one person who is called a system administrator, and he is doing both the jobs. But from a good practice stuff, they should be different positions. Moving on to the next one, which is next concept, which is related to risk. So what's a risk? This is one of the very prime interview questions. So how do you define risk? And I have also asked many people, how do you define the risk? So after CISSP, you should be able to define risk in a very mature manner. What do we understand by that is? So risk is nothing but likelihood of a threat taking advantage of a vulnerability. Let me put it in a different way. So risk is nothing but probability of a threat exploiting a vulnerability and leading to financial losses is called as risk. Please remember this, memorize this, try to understand this. This is the most, one of the good ways to define risk. It is probability of a threat, an external agent, let's say fire, exploiting a vulnerability, means weakness in the system, let's say pieces of paper in the data center, and leading to financial losses. Let's say your servers, your financial information servers are burned. This is called as risk. So if let's say tomorrow you go and do a risk assessment, please ensure you have 3 columns. One is threat, other is vulnerability, other is financial losses. You assign, we'll come to that in terms of risk assessment using quantitative mechanisms. But for the time being, this is how you define a risk, and please don't confuse. So it is probability of a threat exploiting a vulnerability and leading to financial losses. I also read one of the questions which says, is the following statement correct? Probability of a vulnerability exploiting a threat is called as risk. No, it is probability of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. So with that we move on. We understood the concept of risk. Exposure is nothing but the vulnerability. Exposure means in how much quantity will the threat exploit the vulnerability. That's called as exposure. And countermeasure or safeguard, we all understand, it is nothing but the control. Moving on to the next concept. This image is a very self-explanatory image and will help you to understand what all we have understood. Threat agent and threat. This is nothing but threat agent is just the vector. So let's say fire coming from a short circuit is a threat agent, and then the fire is the threat. Vulnerability is pieces of paper in the data center. Risk is financial servers are burned. Asset is server. Exposure is the financial information being burned. And safeguard is, let's say you have fire extinguishers within the organization. So this is how the typical flow of a risk management. This is all about risk management. I hope it is clear. If you have any questions, please feel free to post on the chat window. Moving on to the next concept. Now, whenever you try to understand what is the value of a server, or let's say what is the value of, or let's say you have a company laptop and you want to assign the value of that company laptop. So let's say the laptop cost is $200 US, and then you also understand that you have some client's information. Now that client information will be valuable for your company. So let's say 500 USD is what you have agreed within the organization is the client value of that information, or the monetary cost value of that information. So 500 plus 200, 700 USD. And then you also need to consider that if this laptop is lost, and let's say if the laptop gets into the hands of a competitor, right? So he will get this 500 USD as the value of my client data. So it will be 700 plus 500, 1200. So that's what the cost you should consider as part of your laptop. It is not just the monetary buying cost. It is also about the information on it. If that information gets into wrong hands, what are the controls working on the laptop? So all those things, all the worst case scenarios you should consider to come up to a cost of your asset. So this is again an important concept. These are some of the bullets here: cost to acquire or develop the asset, maintain, protect the asset, value of the asset to owners and users, value of the intellectual property that went into developing the information, price others are willing to pay for the asset, cost to replace if the asset is lost or damaged, operational and production activities that are affected if the asset is unavailable, and so on. So these are some of the points. You may not get any questions on this, but you should understand as what you should consider when you are valuing your asset. Excellent. If you have any questions, please post on the chat window as we move on to the next concept. Now you have two types of assets. One are called as tangible assets, others are called as intangible assets. Whatever you can see and touch is called as tangible. This is a thumb rule. So computer you can see and touch, facilities you can see and touch, supplies you can see and touch. Intangible is whatever you can't see or you can't touch. So let's say reputation, data, intellectual property. Now is information tangible or intangible? This is debatable, but some of the certifications say information is tangible and some other certification says information is intangible. So as such in the exam we will not be asked as what is tangible, what is intangible. CISSP is least interested in testing you on all these petty things. Every question will be a scenario where you will be asked to perform a role of an information security consultant. So let's move on and try to develop all these concepts which will help us to understand the scenarios. Moving on to the next concept, which is all about our risk analysis. So risk analysis, risk assessment, is there any difference? No, there is no difference. Risk analysis and risk assessment, they are nearly synonymous words, but when you talk about risk management, in that case you are also doing the risk assessment and then you are also doing the risk treatment. So risk management is an umbrella word which consists of your risk assessment and risk treatment, both of them. Now risk assessment can be performed with two ways. One is quantitative, other is called as qualitative. So quantitative, as the name suggests, all mathematics are applied. Qualitative, as the name suggests, it is all subjective. It is all on the basis of judgment. So no mathematics is applied. Now let's understand firstly what is quantitative risk analysis. Now CISSP has a lot of calculations here. I will explain these calculations in a very easy manner to you, and you will definitely get one numerical here. So let's understand with the help of this example. So let's say there is a flood which is destroying your server, and the server has customer data. So the asset value is, let's assume it is $10,000. Now how have we calculated this asset value? That is what I explained in a couple of slides back, where we talked about what is the physical cost of that server, what is the associated monetary value of that customer data, what if you lose out that customer data and it gets into wrong hands, and so on. So at finally you have agreed that this is asset value is. So this is your, let's say, $10,000. Now exposure factor, please remember this particular variable which is called as exposure factor. Now exposure factor will be given in the exam, let's say 40%. This means that 40% of the server will be hit if flood occurs, right? Or let's say if flood finally comes and stuck your data center, 40% of the server room will be vanished. So then you have another variable which is called as single loss expectancy. Single loss expectancy, please try to understand this variable. It says single loss expectancy means if the flood comes one time, how much will be the loss expected? So definitely single loss expectancy, which is also called as SLE, is nothing but your asset value into exposure factor. So this means if the flood comes and it hits my data center, and if 40% of my data center is vanished, then my single loss expectancy, this is the loss I will expect. So this is $4,000. I'm sure till here it was very easy to understand and you all understood it. However, if you have any questions, please post on the chat window. Now this was a scenario where the flood hit once. Now I want to understand the scenario over a year. What could be my loss expectancy. Now there's a term which is called as annualized rate of occurrence. This means how many times it is expected that the flood will hit. Yeah, how many times it is expected that the flood will hit. So annualized rate of occurrence, let's say it is given in the question paper as twice in a year. So this means the flood will come 2 times. So what will be the loss in a whole year? It will be 4,000 into 2. That is your single loss expectancy into or multiplied by annualized rate of occurrence. So this is $8,000, and this is called as your annual loss expectancy. So I hope this is clear. Let me just repeat the formulas. So the formulas are your single loss expectancy is nothing but asset value into the exposure factor, and your annualized loss expectancy is nothing but your single loss expectancy into annualized rate of occurrence, ARO. Now people who are hearing these terms first time may be slightly uncomfortable, and I completely respect that. However, I would suggest if you can please spend some time after this webinar, I'm sure you will be able to appreciate it more. And these are very easy to understand. If you can just remember the way I have explained, and with the help of this particular example, you will never forget it. Now the problem comes when in the exam it is given that your threat occurs twice in a year. So in that case, ARO is very simple to calculate. It will be 2. It says 5 times in a year. Definitely ARO will be 5. But it says once in 10 years. I'm sorry. So it says once in 10 years. Now this is the place where students get, or let's say CISSP aspirants get confused as what will be the ARO value. So the best way to calculate this is 1 divided by 10, which is 0.1. Now please have some thought after this webinar. This is like, so it is like once in 10 years. So definitely the probability will be 1 by 10. You need to think on this. Cannot be explained more on the webinar. Yeah, but please remember that if a question, like let's say the last bullet which says 5 times in 10 years, answer is 5 divided by 10, which is 0.5. So this is where students get confused in the exam. So please remember your number of times will come as a numerator, and in how many number of years will come as the denominator, and then you can come up with a value of ARO. So that's where this quantitative risk assessment is all about. Now let's come to qualitative risk assessment. Now when we talk about qualitative, okay, before I start qualitative risk assessment, can we have any questions in the exam on quantitative risk assessment? Yes, you will definitely have a numerical. The numerical will be tough, and it will give you scenarios in terms of various assets which has their asset value. You add all the asset values, then it will give you exposure factor. Then you have to calculate single loss expectancy. It will also give you a hint on how many times the threat occurs. Then you calculate the ARO as explained on the previous slide, and then finally you calculate the annualized loss expectancy. If you can remember the concepts, if you can remember the numerical which we just discussed, you will be able to solve that question. Plus we also have similar questions in the Socrative quiz, which we will be discussing with you just after this webinar. Now moving on to the qualitative risk analysis, as I said, there is no mathematics involved. It is all about judgments. It is all about understanding as what information is there in human, is there with the human beings. So qualitative methods walk through different scenarios of risk possibilities. Okay, let me not get into theory. Let me just explain you what qualitative risk analysis is all about and how it is done. So there is one approach which is called as Delphi method. Now what is Delphi method? What happens is, see, at the end of the day, let's say you want to understand the risk to the reputation. Now can you assign an asset value to reputation? It is very difficult, and that is where qualitative risk analysis will come into picture. So let's say what Delphi method says is, you create a questionnaire, okay, and so let's say the questionnaire will be what do you understand by our reputation? Which are the key brands which you consider as reputation? Is reputation also related to employees of the company? Okay, and you create such kind of questionnaires, and you circulate these questionnaires with the people in the organization, the key stakeholders, let's say people in the managerial position, senior managers, and all key people, right? So they will fill up the responses to these questions in those questionnaires, and there is one moderator who will control this process. Once they fill up the questionnaires, they will submit all the questions back to you, and then you look at those questionnaires, the responses, and then you try to come up with a new questionnaire which is much more refined from the responses from the previous questionnaire, and then you circulate it back to again all the stakeholders, and then they will reply again. And similarly, in this manner, you will come to a conclusion where you will be able to understand what is reputation or how much important it is. So what could be the prime risk to the reputation? So this is a Delphi method. So it is all about people driven approach, a questionnaire driven approach, and there is one moderator who keep on refining the responses received as part of the questionnaires, and then a new questionnaire is developed. Now in Delphi method there are two types. One is consensus Delphi method, other is modified Delphi method. Consensus means people can talk, so all those stakeholders, managers can talk with each other. Modified Delphi method is people are not allowed to talk each other. They have to submit their responses in silos, in isolated manner. Now can we have a question in the exam? No, this is just a concept to perform a qualitative risk analysis. If you can remember this much, whatever we have discussed on this webinar, it is enough for the exam. Excellent. If you have any questions, please post on the chat window. Let us move ahead. Now this is a slide which summarizes qualitative versus quantitative. So requires complex calculations. This I will not get into it. I mean, this is what we have discussed. I am sure this is self-explanatory slide. Moving on to the next concept, which is countermeasure selection. Now here you have this particular some mathematical equation. Now let me just explain you this, and this is more of a thought process which you yourself have to think, right? So let's say there was no control being. Don't read the slide, just please understand what I am saying. Let's say you do not have any control, and the risk rating, which is nothing but your probability of threat into vulnerability into the financial loss. So the risk is 100%. Now let's say you implement a control, and because of that control the risk got decreased to 30%. And let's say for that control you also have a maintenance cost. So let's say 10% is the money spent in the maintenance of that control. So definitely your loss, right? What will be, it will come to your 20%. I mean, just to explain it in a better sense. See, annualized loss expectancy was what? It was in a year how much loss is expected. Now you also built a control, right? So annualized loss expectancy got decreased. So initially let's say it was $100. Now it came down to, let's say 40. Now the loss expectancy was $40. So if you decrease from $100 your $40, you will be left with 60. This means 60 is the benefit of the control, right? But you also spent $10 on the maintenance of that control. So you are left with 50, which is the actual safeguard or value of that particular control. Now this slide needs a thought process, and I would suggest if you can please understand this particular numerical. First of all, what is annualized loss expectancy? It is all about what is the loss expected in a year, and then if you can apply this to this particular equation and try to visualize, I am 200% sure you will be able to understand. Yeah, so it just requires some thought process from your side. And please remember, this is nothing but we are trying to understand the value of safeguard to the company. Now moving on to the next slide, which is all about what are the various procedures or what are the various ways you can handle a risk. This is self-explanatory slide. Risk can be mitigated through a control. Risk can be transferred through an insurance company. Risk can be avoided by just not doing that activity, and risk can be accepted. We are okay with the risk. We will not do anything, right? So then you also have a term which is called as residual risk. Residual risk is nothing but when you mitigate a risk with the help of a control, whatever the final risk is left out, it is called as residual risk. Now if your residual risk is within your risk appetite levels, then you are okay with it. You will not do anything about it. If it is still outside of your risk appetite levels, you are still worried about it, and you must keep thinking as how I can bring this residual risk within my risk appetite levels. So these are some of the concepts which you should understand being an InfoSec professional. Moving on to the next one, which is total risk, is nothing but your probability of threats into vulnerabilities into asset value. This is what we understood. Now you also have control gap exposure. This is again a term which is used in InfoSec profession. It is nothing but when you have implemented a control, right? So whatever risk got mitigated, what is the exposure which is still there? So let's say the exposure left after a countermeasure is implemented. So let's understand this with an example. Say probability of fire in data center is 0.4. However, after implementing a fire extinguisher, it is 0.1. So control gap exposure is 0.1. So 0.1 is the residual risk, or still it is left, which needs to be treated, and that's where your control gap exposure is. That means the control was not able to fill up this exposure, and this is still the result. I mean the risk left out even though the control was implemented. So that's where your control gap exposure comes in. Moving on to the next slide. Now we have various risk assessment approaches. I'll give you some thumb rules here, and please remember these thumb rules. Firstly, CISSP is not going to ask you what is NIST 830, what is Octave, what is FRAP. CISSP exam is not going to test on any of the standards, any of the mature literatures which are part of the standards. But yes, from an InfoSec profession, you should definitely know what does each of these means, because it is important for you to know when you are talking to your clients. Now, please remember NIST 830 is a risk assessment approach, and it is at an IT level. It is at an information systems level. So if you see, these are the various stages which come under risk assessment and which are given by NIST 830. So you start with the system. It is this NIST 830 does not start from business. Okay, it starts from system characterization, threat identification, vulnerability identification, and then once you have threat and vulnerability, you do the control analysis, likelihood determination, impact analysis, risk determination, control recommendations, result documentation. So it is all about understanding the system, the information security, and I mean what could be the risk to my information system. In terms of information security, it can be in terms of privacy, it can be in terms of let's say confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is nothing but information security only. So just remember that NIST 830 is a risk assessment approach, and it is at an information systems level. Then you have FRAP. FRAP is nothing but facilitated risk assessment process. Again, you will not get any question in the exam. However, please remember that FRAP is very similar to NIST 830, and the only thing is you screen, or you pre-screen application systems, okay, to understand as which are the important IT systems to me, and then you can follow the NIST 830 to go and actually do the risk assessment on those systems. So FRAP is nothing but just an initial feeder, and it is more about doing a priority analysis for which systems are critical for you, which systems are less critical for you, and then you go and apply the risk assessment to in more detail to the critical systems, in less detail to the less critical systems, and so on. So just remember that it is nothing but your pre-screening activity. Moving on to Octave. Now Octave is again a risk assessment approach. Now this Octave approach is again at, please don't read the slide, just try to understand these important inputs which I am giving you. If you can remember these inputs for the exam, your question will not go wrong, right? So similar to NIST 830, Octave is again an approach which is based on information technology. So it also does not talk upon business. It is again talking on systems only. However, the good part is when you are doing a risk assessment with the help of Octave, you are involving various stakeholders. You are talking to people also constantly at each and every activity. So let's say, see, at the end of the day, people are the best assets to tell you as what is critical. If a server is critical, why it is critical, right? So you also consider employees of the company to define the risk scenarios, to define asset values, to define what could be the threat values, what could be the what is the value of the existing vulnerabilities, and you are able to calculate risk, which is much more mature than an approach which does not talk to employees. Then you also have a technique which is called as ASNZS 4360. Again, you will not get any question in the exam, but like NIST and Octave, which are more from an information systems perspective, risk assessment, this particular risk assessment approach, which is ASNZS 4360, is more at a business level. So this is very similar to COSO, this is very similar to COBIT, this is very similar to TOGAF, this is very similar to your Zekman approaches. We will cover all this, just bear with me. So this is nothing but a risk assessment approach which talks about business and information systems both. ISO 27001, we all know. I will not spend any more time on this. It is nothing but your information security management system, so ISMS, and it is outside the syllabus of CISSP, so don't worry about this, but it is all about creating a dashboard which can help you analyze the situation of information security in your organization. ISO 27001, the latest version is ISO 27001 2013, which has some 14 domains and some close to 103 control activities. But all this is outside the CISSP syllabus, so don't worry about it. However, it is good to know in an InfoSec profession what is ISO 27001 and what are the names of these domains. So please Google it and keep it for your knowledge purpose. Nothing relevant for the exam point of view, so we will exclude it from this webinar. Similarly, what are 27004, 27005, 27006, 27799? Just for your information, please know the names. Otherwise, it is not required for the exam purpose. Then we move on to Security Steering Committee. As what do we mean by a steering committee? So steering, right? It's a very famous word. I mean, in cars we have steering, right? So what is the value we get from a steering? We can drive the car in a particular direction with the help of a steering. So a very similar concept exists in your CISSP or as part of this particular nomenclature also. So let's say, for example, you are rolling out a business continuity management project in your organization. Now that BCP or BCM project, it will consider various assets, various locations. It will consider your various plants, your storage distribution areas, your ERP systems, your various other legacy applications. And over a period of time, it may consider things which may not be required from a company's survival or immediate survival point of view. So in between the people who are actually implementing this business continuity plan and the senior management of a company, there is a small team which is created, like here also you see, which is called as your business continuity steering committee. Now periodic meetings will be held between the very senior management and the people who are the project managers for this particular project, and they will discuss as what are the current challenges, what are the current risks they are facing while implementing the business continuity management systems. And the senior management will tell them, no, this is not okay, or let's say if you are facing some particular risk, you should do this. So this is like ensuring that the project is aligned to the spirit of the business case and all the objectives are met. The scope is there are no scope creeps occurring in the execution of that project. We are on cost, we are on time, and everything is taken care of. So steering committee is nothing but which ensures that the project is aligned to the expectations of the company. So that's where your concept of steering committee comes in. So let me put it in a simple way. It helps you to steer the project deliverables in the expectations of the business case or the organizations. So it meets the business objectives of the company. So that's where your concept of steering committee comes into picture. In case you have any questions, please post on the chat window, else we'll move ahead. All these slides I can circulate with you. So in case I am jumping a slide, that means it's very plain English and there's nothing to worry in that. So I mean, when you have these slides, you will be able to traverse through them in a very easy manner. Now the next concept in CISSP, which is an important concept, is defense in depth. So when I say defense in depth, you want to protect the centermost asset, right? And you may have various controls starting from the most inner circle to the outermost circle. So let's say the most inner circle is something but virus scanners, and the next is patch management, rule based access control, account management, secure architecture, demilitarization zones, firewalls, virtual private networks, policies and procedures. And the last is physical security, the security guard which is standing on the, or let's say the receptionist sitting at the main gate of your organization. So this is how the defense in depth approach comes in. If somebody wants to have unauthorized access to this asset, he has to compromise all these controls. Now you may be new to DMZ, you may be new to secure architecture, and that is where you have various domains in CISSP. DMZ will be covered in telecommunication, secure architecture will be covered in secure architecture and design domain, rule-based access control will be covered in access controls domain, patch management will again be covered in security operations domain. So policies and procedures is something which we have already covered in the webinar 1 of this series, because that was part of this particular domain only. So at the end of the day, you are trying to get, you will be getting a holistic infosec profession knowledge from this CISSP exam, and that's where this exam is in high value all over the world. Moving on to the next concept, which is all about hiring practices. So these are again plain English statements. Hiring practices: you must perform a background check. You must ask people to sign confidentiality agreements. Intellectual property agreement: this means if you develop a tool as part of this job, the intellectual property will rest with the company, and you cannot claim that I developed it, so it belongs to me. So conflict of interest agreements for positions handling competitive: this is nothing but segregation of duties. You will not create any fraud. In case you have any extra authorizations, you will always inform the management. Non-compete agreements for positions in charge of unique corporate processes. This is nothing but, let's say if you join one IT company and you are servicing a client which is also serviced by another IT company, you cannot join that IT company for a particular number of years. So that is nothing but your non-compete agreements. Employee termination: yeah, this is a very important. In case you fire an employee, okay, you should now that employee is a disgruntled employee. Now he can be a threat to your organization because you have fired him. So that's where he should be escorted from the premises. The HR and his manager and the security guard or security personnel in the organization should escort him from the organization, and his access should be immediately deactivated, and all his system passwords should be removed at the same time. So that's where CISSP provides you some sort of more controls considering the risk of an involuntary termination, and that's where you should definitely look forward for these controls in your own organizations as part of your termination policies from an infosec perspective. Moving on to the next concept, we have some sort of questions now, and these questions we will discuss more at the end of this webinar. We have all these questions in an online format which you will be able to answer in. So let's move on to the next concept, which is your key terms. Now these key terms, if you see here, security through obscurity. This is a very important term which I want you to please keep in mind. When I say security through obscurity, this all means that, let's say you don't want anybody, let's say you created a tool and you don't want anybody to create another tool in the market. You want to have your monopoly. So what you will do is you will create that tool in such a complex manner that nobody can understand it. So this is called as security through obscurity. This means you rely on the complexity of the tool so much, or let's say you make things hidden so much that people in the market will not be able to create another tool of similar nature. So this is called as security through obscurity. So let me give you another example. Let's say there is an aircraft from a Boeing company which is a very innovative aircraft, and let's say then there is some other company which wants to implement, or let's say create a similar aircraft. But the Boeing company has created the aircraft in such a complex manner, and they have made things, they have encrypted the things, and the encryption keys are also very difficult to analyze. So this is like they are bringing, in public they are saying, okay, go and copy whatever resources you have on internet, but then they have encrypted everything. They have whatever is available you can't understand. So this is like they are bringing security through obscurity. So this is just a concept. Please remember, you try to hide something just because it is very complex or just because it is very secret, and yeah, so that's the concept of security through, just a fundamental framework concept. Now there's nothing particular about it which can be tested in the exam. Then DODEF and MODEF are not in CISSP syllabus. You can just have a reading of it. No questions will be asked. COBIT again not in CISSP syllabus. SP 853 again. So if you see, these are nothing but just some frameworks, frameworks which can be used for risk assessment, which can be used to understand your business operations. So let me give you some examples here. Let's understand what is TOGAF. Now again, this is outside CISSP syllabus, but this is part of the literature of CISSP, because ISC Square expects you to at least know what is TOGAF all about, not in detail, but the main spirit of this architecture framework. Now we already learned NIST 830. We also learned Octave, which are more from a systems risk assessment methodologies. The TOGAF is nothing but very similar to your AS NZS 4360, and TOGAF is nothing but your business architecture framework. So it is very similar to COBIT. In case you have done COBIT, you will be able to appreciate TOGAF. However, in a nutshell, it just helps you to align your stakeholder requirements to your enterprise objectives, to your IT objectives, to your processes, and then finally to your IT operations. So that's where the whole alignment comes in, and that's where your COBIT is also all about. That's where your TOGAF is also all about. So it helps you to map your information technology architecture to your business architecture to your stakeholder architecture. So stakeholder requirements architecture. So that's where your TOGAF comes into picture. So if you can just remember this, that it helps in aligning the organization to fulfill its objectives, it is more than sufficient. Then you have something called as Zachman framework. Now when I say Zachman framework, it is again a business framework. So if you see, if let's say tomorrow you want to open a new company, so with the help of this particular framework, you will be able to set up, you will be able to do a complete analysis as what could be my challenges, what could be my risks. So you see data, function, network, people, time, motivation. These are nothing but different perspectives which you should definitely take care. And then on the y-axis also you have objective, scope, enterprise model, system model. So from system model you start with the information technology model, then your data model, and then the functional model. These can be changed as per your company requirements, and then you start filling up all these cells. So it is like brainstorming. So let's say within network, what could be my system? So let's say I want distributed systems architecture. So this is how you keep on pumping the requirements and you fill up this whole framework, and finally you have a very good value addition in terms of where I am, where I want to be, and what could be the challenges and risks. So that's where your Zachman framework comes into picture. SAPSA, or this is again a business framework, and this is again very similar to Zachman framework, but SAPSA firstly you will not get any questions on Zachman. SAPSA definitely you will not get. It is completely a very dry topic, and it's not part of any of the, you cannot, there will be no questions asked in the CISSP exam on the SAPSA framework. So there's nothing to worry here. And I think the only thing the only thing you should remember from an exam point of view is what are the spirit of this architectures like TOGAF, Zachman framework, your NIST 830, your Octave, PRAP, and then AZ, NZS 4360. So if you can remember just the spirit of all these risk management approaches and the business architecture frameworks, this is more than sufficient for the exam. So that's where we complete our information security risk management domain. One important point I would like to highlight is this is relatively easy domain, but as I said in the webinar 1 series, people who are from a technical background find this domain as difficult, and CISSP cannot be cracked till the time you really experience and practice solving questions, and that's where our next part is. So in case you have missed out our webinar 1 series for this particular domain, I would request you if you can please have a complete view of that video before you start doing the quiz. You will be able to score well on the quiz only if you have gone through both the webinars for this particular domain. I'll just hand over to my colleague for the questionnaire session.